Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ben's Book Club, a monthly virtual gathering looking at themes relating to Benjamin Franklin, the 18th century, and American history. For this month, I'm very happy to introduce Michael Bundock. He is a barrister, a trustee of Dr. Johnson's House, and chair of the Johnson Society of London. He is an honorary research associate in the Department of English Language and Literature at UCL, and he's here to talk to us about the Fortunes of Francis Barber. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much.
So the first question that I wanted to ask you really is kind of what led you to write the Fortunes of Francis Barber? If you wouldn't mind just filling in some of the gaps for those who might not know the life of this man.
Yeah, sure. To answer that, perhaps we can start, perhaps you can display the first of the slides, which I've put together. That's the one. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for the welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon with you and to talk about Francis Barber on a momentous day in which other events are happening elsewhere, I believe. So I'm very glad that people have chosen to come along this afternoon. As you've just heard, I'm a director of Dr. Johnson's House Trust, and I spend quite a lot of time at Dr. Johnson's house. And if you go there, as I hope you have done or will do when you're allowed to do such things, you will see that there is a copy on the wall there of this picture, which is on your screen, sometimes titled A Young Black, painted about 1770 by Joshua Reynolds. And in the caption to the copy that's in Dr. Johnson's house, it says something like, believed to be Francis Barber, Dr. Johnson's servant. And this I've always found quite intriguing. If you read any biography of Samuel Johnson, the great 18th century man of letters, somewhere in the footnotes or in the margins, you will find some kind of reference to Francis Barber. It may be quite small, but there will be something about this young black boy, as he was then, who became Samuel Johnson's house servant and who lived in Gough Square in London. And so that was my starting point, was just to know a bit more about him. Obviously in modern biographies, he tends to be, there's a bit more conversation about a discussion of him, but I still felt there was more to be known, and so I wanted to explore it further. And so this was my starting point, to find out. One question I wanted to answer was, is this really his portrait? Because I think it's an astonishing and striking portrait. It's a very powerful image of, a very central image of a black man painted in the 18th century, where he's the only person in the picture. This is not, as it is in some other paintings of that period, him, a young black man as a servant in the background or off to the side. This is a portrait, and it's one of somebody of some nobility almost, and dignity. So very intriguing, and I wanted to know, is this really Francis Barber? And so I explored to find out what is the story of Francis Barber. Just to give a relatively quick introduction to it, I think his life divides into 6 distinct sections, and the first one is in Jamaica. And he was born in Jamaica in about 1742 to 1743, and he was born into slavery. He was the child of a slave, and he was born on a sugar plantation owned by a Colonel Richard Bathurst, called the Orange River Plantation, which was in St Mary's Parish in Jamaica. And the background of that, of course, is the brutality and cruelty of the slavery regime as it operated in Jamaica. And this must have been a daily part of his life, and something which he was very aware of until they left Jamaica, which they did when he was aged about 12 in 1752, his owner, Richard Bathurst, who was obviously not much of a businessman, and the plantation went bust, and he sold it and returned to England. He brought with him, as a young boy, to a servant to accompany him, as a number of people did coming to London from the colonies at that period. He brought with him the young Francis Barber. And at some point, a couple of years after, that was in 1750 when he came to England. In 1752, Francis started the second period of his life, which was in Gough Square in London. Can we have the next slide, please? And here we have Samuel Johnson's house in Gough Square as it was painted in 1881. It looks pretty much the same just now, except that the buildings on the right are now a bit more modern, but Johnson's house, which is in the centre of the picture, really looks much the same as it was in Johnson's day. And the reason that Francis Barber ended up living here was that Samuel Johnson, the great literary figure, was a friend of Richard Bathurst's son, who was also called Richard Bathurst. He was a doctor. And it was through that connection that Francis Barber became a servant in Johnson's household. Johnson was at this stage not the great literary figure that he became, the author of his major dictionary of the English language, which was published just 3 years later in 1755, but he was on his way to becoming a major literary figure. And so Francis Barber became part of his household. And this was immediately after the death of Samuel Johnson's wife, Elizabeth. She died in 1752, and immediately after that, so possibly with some kind of idea that having a young boy in the house might be something to cheer Johnson, who was clearly deeply depressed at this time, but possibly also because Francis Barber needed somewhere to live, and so he was a possibility. And so Johnson provided a home for him, and he lived in this household for a number of years. At the same time as quite a number of people, Johnson took in many people who were in need, and this partially out of motives of charity, partially because Johnson suffered from a desperate fear of solitude and found it very difficult to cope with, and he liked to have people around him. So there were a number of residents in the house at different times, two of them in particular, Anna Williams, who became effectively a housekeeper. She was blind, she was a poetess, and she was famously rather ill-tempered, and so quite a difficult person to get on with in the house. And she and Barber fell out on many occasions. Another resident was Robert Levitt, who was a sort of a poor person's doctor. They had no medical qualifications, but he went out and gave what medical treatment he could to poor people who often paid him in the only way they could, which was in gin, with predictable results. And so he was often drunk and was probably an alcoholic. And he was a rather morose individual. So they were other members of the household. And one of the interesting things which happened at this time was Johnson decided to have Barber taught by a writing master called Desmoulins. And so Barber was taught to read and to write. An interesting thing to happen to a young black servant at that time, even when many people, of course, were completely illiterate. And there's a very interesting piece of manuscript, which is on the next slide, please. I always find this very atmospheric, this particular scrap of paper, because this is Francis Barber's handwriting practice. And this is him practicing writing his handwriting. And he's using manuscript paper, which Johnson was using for working, or scrap paper from the manuscript for working on the dictionary of the English language. So this is at about 1755 and 1756. And I find this astonishing because this means that we can place Barber not only in London, in a particular house in Gough Square, but in a particular room in the garret where Johnson was writing his dictionary of the English language. And somewhere in the corner, Francis Barber is practicing his handwriting. And the astonishing thing is that these slips have survived, bound in with some manuscript of the dictionary, which is now in the Beinecke Library at Yale. And that's where these slips come from. And to go and see those in person and to think this is the very paper on which this young boy learning to write did as we probably all did as when we were children that age, which is write your name over and over. So this is Francis Barber's handwriting. The next stage in his life was when he left the household, which he did in 1756. He'd clearly got a bit fed up with the difficulties of living in this rather difficult and awkward household with some rather difficult people. And so he left and he went to work for an apothecary in Cheapside called Edward Ferrand, and stayed there for 2 years, living there and doing some kind of errands and odd jobs that might support an apothecary's practice. But then 2 years later, he had a dramatic change of plan, and the next stage of his life began in 1758 when he joined the Navy, and he signed up and went to sea on the HMS Stag. And he served there as a landman, which was the term for somebody who was a novice. They had no seagoing experience, and gradually you would move up through experience and training and become an able seaman. But he started off, and indeed remained, he never went beyond being a landman. And Johnson was very distressed that Barber had left the household, and distressed, he didn't know initially that he'd gone to sea. But when Barber left, he placed an advert in the paper, and that is on the next slide, please. So this is an advert which which Johnson placed in the newspaper, in the Daily Advertiser, on 2 days in succession. Whereas Francis Barber, a black boy, has been for some months absent from his master and has been said to have lived lately in Wapping or near it. This is to give him notice that if he will come to his master or apply to any of his master's friends, he will be kindly received. And it's an interesting advert for a number of reasons. Adverts of this kind, this general kind, were common at this time. So it was common to have a missing persons advert of some kind, and that would sometimes be for a runaway. But the usual tone of such an advert, especially when it concerned a slave, would be very different from this. It would be a threat quite often, don't help this person, and it will be a reward. It would say, if you bring him back, there's money in it. So the tone of those adverts were very different from this, in which he says that if he makes contact with Johnson, he will be kindly received. So an interesting indication of Johnson's desire to get him back, but apparently still good feeling and goodwill towards him. But he didn't come back at that time. As I say, he remained in the Navy, in fact, for 2 years until 1760, and saw action during that time, during the 7 Years' War. But Johnson was very keen that he should come back, and he pulled strings at the Admiralty. And eventually in 1760, he got him discharged. And this was not something Barber wanted. He had no wish to leave, but Johnson had brought it about that he left the Navy and he returned to Johnson's service. And then we enter the next stage, the fifth of the 6 stages of his life. And this is a period in which he is in Johnson's service for a long period of time, from 1760 to 1786. And during that time, for the initial period, he worked as a servant, doing the errands and the odds and ends that people did as a household servant. But Johnson also sent him to be educated at the well-respected Bishop's Stortford Grammar School, where he studied for a number of years. And this is rather odd, one has to say, because at this period, by this time, Barber by now is about 26 years old. And so how this worked, that he was part of a group of teenage boys at the Bishop's Stortford Grammar School, it must have been very strange. But Johnson was very anxious that he had a very good education, similar in many ways to Johnson's own education at Lichfield Grammar School. Barber returned to Johnson's service, and then in 1773, a very major event in his life took place when he married Elizabeth Ball. She was white, and that provoked a number of reactions from different people. Some were openly hostile to the marriage, in particular Johnson's friend and first major biographer, John Hawkins, was bitterly hostile, and his openly racist comments in his biography indicate very clearly his attitude to Barber and to his marrying a white woman. Many other people were supportive, and in particular Johnson was very supportive of Barber and of Elizabeth, and took them into his house. They carried on living there, and indeed had their family there. So it became a house where Barber's young children were living. They had, in the end, 4 children. Johnson died in 1784, and the other significant, another major event in Barber's life was the will which Johnson had written, and that's on the next slide, please. Thank you very much. And if you look right down to the bottom of that slide, about 5 lines from the end of the major part of the text, you can just see it says, "All the rest, residue and remainder of my estate and effects, I give and bequeath to my said executors in trust for the said Francis Barber, his executors and administrators." So here's Samuel Johnson in his will, leaving large provision to Francis Barber. He had in fact already given him an annuity of £70 per annum. And to give you an idea of how much that's worth, when he was in the Navy, Barber's earnings would have been £11 a year. So £70 per annum as an annuity in comparison to that. And he also made Barber his residuary heir, so all the remainder of his estate after a number of bequests went to Barber, and in the end that totaled about £1,500 in cash. So this is a very large and significant bequest, and again one which was hugely controversial in some circles in the 18th century. So we come to the last stage of Barber's life, and he moved to Lichfield, where Johnson had been brought up and had encouraged him to move there after Johnson's death. And he settled there and lived there or around there for the rest of his life. There's one interesting slide which I want to show you about Lichfield to give an idea of society at that time and what it was like for a young black person, a former slave, to be in England. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is an advertisement which appeared in Aris's Birmingham Gazette in 1771. And I find this particularly significant because it's an advert for an auction sale. And as you can see, it's taking place at the house of Mrs. Webb in the city of Lichfield. So this is in Johnson's birthplace. And the second paragraph tells you what's for sale. And it's a Negro boy from Africa, supposed to be about 10 or 11 years of age. He is remarkably, some word which I can't read, well proportioned, speaks tolerable good English, of a mild disposition, friendly, officious, sound, healthy, fond of labour, and for colour an excellent fine black. If we find that offensive, that's because it is offensive. And that's only a few years, of course, before Barber moved to Lichfield, that such a sale could be taking place there. Barber briefly became quite a respected member of the community in Lichfield, was elected a dozener, a sort of local jury official. but rapidly fell into poverty. And he moved to a nearby village called Burntwood and set up a school there, an elementary school. And it is possible, it's hard to prove one way or the other, but it's possible he was the first black schoolmaster in England. But it wasn't a very successful school, and he ran out of money and was examined under the Poor Law, and he died in poverty on the 13th of January, 1801. Elizabeth Barber, his wife, his widow, lived on in Lichfield, also ran a school for a while, but died in some poverty in 1816. So that's rather a canter through the life of Francis Barber, to give you a background. That was the story, as I eventually found it out to be, and that was the person that my book is about.
Thank you very much for giving that brief overview of the story. It's a very interesting one, having read the book myself. And you've kind of covered this a little bit. You've shown some of the sources that you saw while you were doing your research. But what I find the most interesting is the fact that there is sort of, there are things that we don't know and that we have to kind of guess from the sources. So when you were doing your research, what were the main sources you relied on, and how did the sources affect your research and the writing process?
Well, I have to say it was certainly quite a challenge from many points of view, because if you want to write a biography about Samuel Johnson, for example, you will drown in sources, because there are all his published works, there are published letters, there are endless biographies, academic articles, but endless primary sources, diaries, journals, and so on, and manuscripts, of course, of Johnson himself. When it comes to writing about Francis Barber, the challenge is very different, because there are not that many surviving sources. That we have a handful of letters from Barber. So what one is rather forced to do is work around the record. So he's mentioned in quite a lot of other people's diaries and journals, because they were interested primarily in Johnson. So they would be going to visit Johnson and they would have a passing comment about Barber. Or it might be there'd be a piece in the newspapers about Johnson, as there often was as he became a literary celebrity. It might just mention him being attended by his black servant, Francis Barber, or something like that. So because he was in the orbit of somebody who became a literary celebrity, you can pick up odd references to him here and there. But I deliberately tried to broaden out the story and make it a story not just about Francis Barber, but about the black community in London in the 18th century, and their experiences, many of which would have been common to other people in his position. So serving as a domestic servant. The domestic servant was the single most common occupation in London at the time, and there would have been many people in his position. So to be able to broaden out and get a picture of other people who had his kind of experiences, you had to look at these kind of accounts. Somebody has used a phrase which I like, which is donut biography. And it's the idea that you have all these resources in a sort of circle going round, which are peripheral, and they're kind of glimpses and side angles. But in the middle, where you'd really like Barber's voice to be, you have a big hole, and you somehow have to construct a life out of that. And of course, one wishes rather more one had his voice. That's what one would really like. But we have to make do with the few letters that we have.
Absolutely. And I think that what's really great about this book is that it does some of that, not only, as you said, about Francis Barber, but also about the community in general. So I was wondering if you might want to expand a little bit on what it would have been like for kind of a young slave from Jamaica, such as Francis Barber, who was about 10 when he came over, to arrive in 18th century London.
Yes, as I mentioned, it wasn't an unusual experience, in that it was quite common for people who had worked in the colonies, when they came back to Britain at some point, to bring with them a boy or a girl as a servant, more often a boy, as a house servant. And it was a sort of status symbol thing, and sometimes they'd be dressed up in exotic livery, and this was a sort of fashion accessory almost. And so people were coming back from the colonies at this time, but there was also, of course, a black community already in London who'd been here for a long time, and so the people who were coming back from the colonies inevitably made contact with those people, and the black community grew in size at that time. We don't know the size of the black population in London at the time. It's very difficult to make estimates, but we're certainly talking some thousands of people at the time. So to be a young black boy, as Barber was in London, was not unknown, but it was still very unusual, and so you were an object of interest. And it has to be said sometimes of hostility. There's an interesting reference in the letters of Ignatius Sancho, a black writer of that time, whose letters are easily available in print. And he refers to going on one occasion to visit, I think it was Vauxhall Gardens, with his wife and his family. And he records that on the way back, he says, we were followed, but not much abused. And I thought that phrase, not much abused, is very telling, because it's the not much which is so powerful, in that the abuse was less than it normally was, or might have been expected, or something like that. So clearly there's a degree of hostility to people in Barber's position from some people. And there's also a big issue about their status, and that's, is somebody who's been brought from a slave state, a slave society like Jamaica, when they're brought to England, do they become free? Or when they're living as a servant in somebody's household, are they still in effect a slave? And there are very difficult questions around that, because there was no clear answer. In Jamaica, these things were not only regulated by long established practice, but by law. There were codes about slavery. There was nothing like that in England. And it wasn't really until 1772 with the Somerset Case that we start getting legal discussions about whether somebody is a servant or a slave. So all these issues are swirling around in the background of Barber's experience of being a young black boy in London at that time, as is, as I've indicated, the hostility of some people in Johnson's circle. I mean, John Hawkins' biography of Johnson, which was the first major biography, as I said, published just after Johnson's death. And it has an appendix of about 11 pages at the end, which is devoted purely to Francis Barber. That's all it's there for. So an astonishing level of hostility. But on the other hand, you've got Samuel Johnson, who supports Barber in many ways, and other figures like James Boswell later on, who supports Barber. So you have a mixture of reactions and responses to Barber in London at that time.
I can imagine that there would have been a mixed reaction. And I just wanted to pick the picture of kind of the idea of Samuel Johnson, who has been described as kind of this really kind of big character with Francis Barber, and they seem like an unlikely pair. What do you think life would have been like in the house at 17 Gough Square?
Chaotic, I think, is probably the chaotic and slovenly, probably. And in short, a perfect home for a teenage boy in many respects. Johnson was famously untidy, didn't much care about the house being clean. He was, as you say, physically a very big man for his time, bulky, and subject to all kinds of nervous tics. He had many physical ailments, and one of them we think may have been Tourette's syndrome. And so his behavior was often very odd. So you had this very strange couple, as you rightly say. I mean, Johnson was himself, would have stood out in a crowd, and I'm quite sure people looked at him as he walked past in the same way as they would have looked at Barber. And you've got them together. Johnson with depressive tendencies just after the death of his wife, of course. I mean, within weeks of the death of his wife. And that in itself had been a difficult relationship. And so her death had plunged him into depression, because obviously whatever he wanted to resolve could no longer be resolved. And so a very difficult place to be. I've already indicated the Anna Williams and Robert Levitt and other people in the house as well. There would have been people working on Johnson's dictionary. The garret in Johnson's house was a place of work, and there would have been people to help Johnson with writing materials for it, working there. So very busy, chaotic, dirty, slovenly. But on the other hand, the alternative for Barber was not great. Being a young black boy in London in the 18th century, here with Johnson, you have as much security and protection and food and shelter and clothing as you're going to get anywhere.
You mentioned a bit in your introduction to Francis Barber that when you were explaining his life, that he worked in an apothecary for a little bit, and then he went to the Navy. So why would the Navy have been so enticing to Francis Barber at that time?
Well, I suppose it's a sort of push and pull elements. The push, obviously, as I've said, is his life at Johnson's household, which must have been pretty irksome and tiresome and so on from time to time. But there are a lot of pull factors as well in wanting to join the Navy. And the first one, obviously, is money. A regular wage, 16 shillings and 6 pence each month coming in, plus obviously you get your food, you get clothing. So this is quite an attractive prospect in many ways. And then there are other factors which made the Navy quite an attractive proposition. One of which was that, so far as we can tell from the figures, the population of black sailors was higher than in the population at large. So it may have been that made it quite appealing from Barber's point of view. And there is a sense that at least it was, although life at sea was pretty tough, to say the least, there was a sense in which it was pretty tough for everybody. So whatever your role was on board ship, and whether you were black or white, there was a sense in which everybody was suffering the same things. And there was at least a relatively liberal attitude towards black people in the Navy. I'd hesitate to describe it as liberal, at least relative to society outside the Navy. And then I suppose the other thing is simply the excitement of, he's a teenage boy going to run away to sea, basically, and join the Navy at a time when we're in the 7 Years' War. So the Navy is a Navy at war, and Barber did sea action during that period. So it's simply the excitement of that. So quite a lot of good reasons that make it actually quite a sort of rational decision from Barber's point of view.
You mentioned previously that Samuel Johnson had basically arranged for him to then leave the Navy at one point. So then he returned to live with Johnson. So how would you characterize their relationship after he returned to his employ?
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's a very heavy-handed act on Johnson's part. It's very much the heavy-handed father figure saying, I know what's best for you. And Barber, after all, has taken this decision of his own free will, and it's his choice to join the Navy. And so that was presumably very unwelcome when he was pulled out of it by Johnson and had little alternative but to go back and be Johnson's manservant. But they seem to have got over that stage, and the very fact that Barber stayed there for the rest of Johnson's life, apart from that interlude when he goes to school, suggests that they certainly resolved whatever issues there were. And I think what happens over this very long period when Barber is there is gradually Barber's status changes, because of course as a young boy he's simply a servant and he does what he's told. But as he gets older, and especially once he's married, he's got children, he becomes a much more responsible figure in the house. And eventually, towards the end of Johnson's life, I think we have this extraordinary role reversal. He's started off as somebody who's completely dependent on Johnson, but toward the end of Johnson's life, when he's very isolated and the household effectively breaks down and everybody leaves except Francis Barber and Elizabeth Barber and their children. And towards the end of their life, it's effectively almost as if Johnson has become part of Barber's household, whereas Barber was originally part of his. And Barber and Elizabeth Barber become effectively his carers. They're the guardians of the door as to who comes in to see Johnson, and they're nurses as well. And in fact, Francis Barber is one of only two people who's with Johnson when he dies, the other being a young clergyman. So a complete reversal in their relationship, and I think it becomes one genuinely of friendship rather than dependency.
I think that's particularly telling, especially in the description in the book of how towards the end of Johnson's life, when he was very ill, that anybody who wanted to go see Johnson had to go through Francis Barber.
He's the keeper of the door.
Exactly. And do you think Francis Barber's life changed when he then became Johnson's heir?
Yes, I do. It changed in a number of ways. And the first one, obviously, was the money. And this is a huge sum of money. And Barber has never had money like that in his life. And then the other major change was his move to Lichfield. So he's moved from the City of London to a small provincial city. It's one where Johnson is very well known. He's the local boy made good from Lichfield, so everybody knows who Barber is. Barber has visited before with Johnson. And to begin with, I think he's quite well respected and accepted. As I mentioned, he's elected a dozener, which is an indication of that's as a result of the election of his neighbours, so they obviously held him in some regard. But clearly, he wasn't good at handling money, and he may have been spendthrift or whatever, because he managed to work through this very large sum of money, and I think must have traded the annuity in for a capital sum, because that all goes away as well, and that should have lasted him for the rest of his life. But certainly his life changes from the point of view as those early years. He has money for the first time in his life. He has his own home and living in Lichfield. So quite a difference there. And the other thing, I suppose, is that as the various biographies of Johnson are published, then he becomes a better known figure in his own right. And there are mentions of him in the newspapers and so on. So a very different life to what he'd been living in London.
Yeah, and I think also that was very interesting, that whole kind of the battle of the biographers, so to speak, of Johnson's life, and how, obviously one was very disparaging of Francis Barber, while Boswell was, was nicer, so in that way. So I guess that must have taken a toll as well in his life, being in the papers that much, most likely based on this kind of debate that was going on.
Yes, his relationship with Boswell, he certainly helped Boswell with materials for what was to become Boswell's great biography of Johnson, his life of Samuel Johnson, and provided him one very important account which survives, is the account which Barber gave of Johnson's last days. And in fact, Barber went, I think, the day after Johnson's death and spoke to James Boswell's brother, who was in London at the time. James Boswell was in Scotland, and he told him, gave him an account of Johnson's death, and Boswell's brother wrote that down, sent it in a letter which still survives to James Boswell, and he used it as the basis for the death scene in The Death of Johnson in his Life of Johnson. So a very important source, and his relationship with Boswell was very good, and Boswell supported him in various ways in his last years in Lichfield.
So I'm going to change the topic slightly, but we are Benjamin Franklin House, so
Mhm.
we always try and get a question in there about the man himself. So it's
All
my
right.
it's my understanding that Johnson and Franklin met. Could you tell us a little bit more about their meeting?
Yes, they did. It's extraordinary to think of these two massive figures in 18th century London, both living there at the same time. And we know that Benjamin Franklin knew a lot of people in Johnson's circle, um, but we know of just one occasion when we know that they did meet, and that was on the 1st of May 1760. And it was at a meeting of a charity called the Associates of Dr. Bray, and that had been set up by Dr. Bray, a clergyman, and it was essentially for the to promote the conversion and the education of black people, both slave and free, in America. And it provided money for schools and for books and for libraries, and that kind of thing. It wasn't an anti-slavery organization. It was more about education um, and providing learning and Christian teaching in particular for black people. And Johnson became one of the associates, a member of that organization. Um, and they met monthly and had a meeting on the 1st of May 1760, and the records of the meeting survive. And at that time, the chairman of the associates was Benjamin Franklin. And he chaired that meeting, and at that meeting, Samuel Johnson was present, and they're both listed in the attendance record. And there were only 8 people there, so I think it's safe to say if there's only 8 people in a room, then they must have met. Although sadly, we have not the slightest account of what they said to each other. Somebody should write a fictional account of the meeting of Samuel Johnson and Benjamin Franklin. It would be a great story. But it was interesting that at the time they met, this was when Francis Barber had left Johnson's household and gone to the Navy. And by chance, at the same time, Benjamin Franklin, who was in London with his son William, and William had a slave called King, and King had run away at this period, exactly the same time. So one wonders what Johnson might have said about his servant who had gone away, and Benjamin Franklin might have said about his son's slave who had run away. And it's also interesting to notice that when Johnson died, he left money from the publication of his prayers, and he left it to the Associates of Dr. Bray. So financially supported them throughout his life. So that's the occasion. That's what we know about the meeting of Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Johnson.
There definitely should be something written about it, especially because they were two quite big characters.
Yeah.
So I can imagine it was interesting.
And with lots in common too. I mean, areas like interest in science, which obviously Benjamin Franklin was, amongst many other things, an experimental scientist. And Johnson was fascinated by science and had a laboratory in one of his houses for a while, and used to carry out experiments and so on. So I think they would have had a lot to talk about.
Definitely. And also, just for those who are tuning in today, we do actually know what happened to King, the slave that ran away. When he was found again, he was being taught music and to read and write by a wealthy woman in Sussex. So they did find him again. But yes, I agree. I think it would have been an interesting discussion between the two men. So I guess the last question that I would like to ask is kind of to bring things back to Francis Barber. Do we know what happened to Barber's family after his death?
We do, and again, and this was one of the very interesting things I found when working on the life. I should say that Francis and Elizabeth Barber had 4 children, and they had 2 sons. One of their first son died very young, about 14 months old, and he was called Samuel. And I think the source of the name is fairly obvious, and especially because when they had a second son later on, they called him Samuel as well, obviously after Samuel Johnson. And they had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Anne. And Elizabeth died aged about 20, and Anne didn't marry. But Samuel, the second son, he did marry, and he had an interesting life in itself. He worked in the potteries for a while, but then became a leading figure in the Primitive Methodist Church in Staffordshire, and became a well-known preacher, and there's an account of his life there. And he had a number of children himself, and in fact, when you start looking at the family tree of the Barbers, it broadens out immensely. So there must be large numbers of Barber family members still living in Britain and in America, probably, because we know that some of the Barber family went to America. And we can trace their descent. I certainly traced one line down. I thought this was very interesting, just to bring it right up to date. Can we have the last of the slides, which was on the... So here we have, there's a list down the side, and this is all father to son descent. So Francis Barber to Samuel Barber, Samuel to Isaac, Isaac begat Enoch, Enoch begat Edward. It sounds like a biblical genealogy here. Edward had a son called Norman, and Norman had a son called Cedric Barber. And this is Cedric Barber, who I've met on a number of occasions. So quite extraordinary to think we have this direct descent, and very fascinating, always fascinating to meet a member of the Barber family who can claim to be related directly, father to son, descended from that young boy who was brought to England from slavery in 1750.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting to be able to trace that line of genealogy right there. Well, we have time for some questions. So if anybody who is watching us right now would like to ask any questions to Michael, you can send it in the Q&A or in the chat down below, and I will read them out. Well, the first question that we had, you already answered, which is, are there descendants of Francis Barber, which we know. But we'll just see if we have any other questions coming in. Jonathan Putnam has said the book is excellent. Thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you very much.
An anonymous attendee has asked, is there much interaction between Barber's descendants and the Johnson house today?
Well, certainly on one occasion, a couple of occasions actually, I know Cedric Barber has been to Johnson's house and has been filmed for television programs. There was the series made by David Olusoga, which was on BBC Two, and you can still watch on catch up on Britain's Black Past. And one small segment of that is devoted to Francis Barber, and you can see an interview with Cedric Barber there, which is very interesting to hear Cedric talking about his ancestor. And certainly Cedric was at the house on another occasion when a television series was being made. So yes, there is some connection. But always interested to have more. And there is a record of somebody many years ago coming to the house from a visitor from America who announced that they were a descendant of Barber. But unfortunately, nobody, this is probably about 40 years ago, nobody kept any record of who this was and how they were descended. But it will be very interesting to know.
I think the same anonymous attendee added, I could see a Barber family reunion at your house someday.
Well, that would be fascinating and great. You'd have to ask the Barber family if they wanted to do that.
So the next question that we have is, could you explain a little bit more about the Somerset case?
Mm-hmm. Well, the background to that case was the fact that the status of slavery in England was very uncertain. As I've said, it was clear in the colonies, it was well established and so on. And the Somerset case was brought because a particular slave called Somerset had run away from his master and was recaptured and was to be sent back into slavery in, I think it was Jamaica. And Granville Sharp, who was the first major abolitionist activist, brought a case, now known as the Somerset Case, effectively in the hope that he could get slavery declared illegal. That's what he wanted. He wanted it to be a test case, although it centered around a rather smaller question about whether you could send somebody who had been a slave once in the colonies and had come to England, could you send them back by force? So they're rather different question. But many people, including the slave owners and slave traders in the West India interest, saw it as a test case, and the West India interest fought it very hard. It was decided by Lord Mansfield in 1772, and he decided in favour of Somerset, who went free. Exactly what it decided has been argued about ever since, but it was certainly treated by many people, whatever it decided in law, many people saw it as saying we could not have slavery in England. There was really not quite any such clear statement out of it, but it was the first major blow against slavery in England as opposed to in the colonies.
And I think what was interesting about that case as well is that Lord Mansfield had a black great niece. I think that's correct, right? So that created another dimension to the case.
It did. Dido Bell, yes, was living in his house at the time. So there was lots of interesting dynamic about that case.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for taking the time to speak to us today. That's all the time we have. And thank you to all the attendees for asking your questions. If you have any more, feel free to send us an email at info@benjaminfranklinhouse.org, and I can pass them along. But yes, thank you so much for joining us today, Michael.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
And please do join us next month for the next edition of Ben's Book Club, which will be from Professor Vincent Brown to talk about his book Tacky's Revolt. It is all free. It is available. All the information is available on our website, www.benjaminfranklinhouse.org. And we hope to see you next week. Thank you. Goodbye.